Hey, Scott here. Thanks for joining us on the Fly Over Country podcast. We are so grateful for everybody who listens in each week. We've got a growing audience, and we're glad to hear from you. Don't forget to hit us up on Twitter. And we also post, if you're listening to this on audio, you can see a lot of our interviews on video on our YouTube channel as well. So consume our content, post it, let us know how you like it. And if there are guests that you want to hear from that we can get for you, let us know. We'll try to get them and bring them on the show. This week, I am so pleased about the guest. His name is Drew Holden. You may not have heard of Drew, but if you're on Twitter and you're someone who consumes a lot of media content like I do, Drew Holden has become an essential resource. On Twitter, he is at Drew Holden 360, at Drew Holden 360. And what Drew is famous for is doing these long threads exposing hypocrisy, exposing how things are just not true, and really shining a light on some media narratives, on some Democratic politician narratives. And when he grabs onto a subject, he is an absolute bulldog. He is one of the best, I think, public affairs, political affairs, information watchdogs right now in all of social media. Again, it's at Drew Holden 360. The man's name is Drew Holden. You also see him writing occasionally for the New York Times, for Fox News, the Washington Post, National Review Online, and the Washington Free Beacon. I want you to listen to this conversation. Drew was extremely insightful, and I'm so excited to present it to you right here on the Flyover Country podcast with Scott Jennings.
Attention passengers, we ask that you please fasten your seatbelts at this time and secure all baggage underneath your seat or in the overhead compartments. Flyover Country with Scott Jennings is prepared for takeoff.
All right, welcome back to the Flyover Country podcast. I'm Scott Jennings. Appreciate you being with us this week. We have a great episode, as I mentioned at the top of the show. This is one of those weeks where I'm having someone on the show who I don't really know, but I've been excited to have on the show because I wanted to talk to the guy. His name is Drew Holden. And Drew, thanks for being with us on the Flyover Country podcast.
Scott, the pleasure's mine, sir. I really appreciate you having me on. And you're right. It's great. It's great. Albeit through a camera to get to meet you.
That's why I started this podcast, because there's a whole bunch of people that I want to meet out there. And so I figured they would be more likely to talk to me if I put a camera and a microphone in front of them. Drew, you are famous on Twitter for your threads. You're the thread guy. So if you're especially if you're a conservative and you're on Twitter and you spend a good chunk of your day online outraged by something you read in the media or something a Democrat said or something the White House did, Drew shows up and then does a thread either exposing how wrong it was or exposing the hypocrisy or exposing the stupidity of it. And so as frustrated as you get with what you've seen, Drew comes in and you're like a salve. You're like the aloe plant of the conservative internet. So I just want to start. The reason I wanted to have you on is because I wanted to ask you principally, how did you decide to start doing this? Because when I read your threads, I see these are time-consuming research projects. They take a lot of work. You don't half-ass it. And so tell us here on the Flyover Country pod, how did Drew Holden start doing threads, and what was the first one you did?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. They are certainly time-consuming. I feel like lately it's really started to hit me of just how time-intensive they can be. I started almost 2 years ago now, and what it originally prompted, I didn't even really know, like the idea of a thread as kind of a construct or thing didn't really make sense to me. But I remember I was reading the news actually after Don Imus had passed away, and there was just this level of ferocity in the headlines and the obituaries and the write-ups about him, right? So Don Imus, famous conservative personality, he made a really ugly remark at one point in his professional career about the Rutgers women's basketball team, and then spent a lot of time trying to apologize for that, I think, right? And so I think it's best to not try and define someone by their worst moment. He raised a ton of money for cancer and for other charities, and seemed, at least to my take, to have learned from it toward the end of his life. Be that as it may, he's a shock jock, right? He's a radio personality who was just absolutely lampooned by the corporate press when he had passed away. And I thought to myself, this can't always be the case. And so I looked back, and it happened to take place about a month and a half after the assassination of General Soleimani of Iran.
Yep.
And I looked In particular, I looked at a headline from the Washington Post that referred to Soleimani as Iran's most revered general.
Yes.
And I looked at it and I was like, man, you can take a look at these words and think about them differently. The New York Times did an interview with this very sad Iranian student who said that they always felt comfortable. He was like a security blanket out in the world to have him exist. And so I looked back and I was like, something's off here, right? No matter what somebody thinks of Imus, there's no way you can think more lowly of him than a mass murdering terrorist, right? Like that just doesn't compute regardless of your politics. And so I put them all side by side. And I just tagged the outlets, and I think I left the rest to the reader to say, look, this is ridiculous. This can't be real. And it got some engagement. I mean, at the time I didn't really have any Twitter followers. I mean, I had a couple of hundred or something, and it took off. And I thought to myself, I was like, wow, if what I think about the corporate press is true, this is not a one-off, right? There are other examples of this across time. And so I started kind of looking for them to say, where are these? It really did start originally with Hypocrisy. Where is it where we're describing two things that are, at least on their surface, relatively similar, but they get described in radically different ways? And over time, that's, of course, taken on a bit of a life of its own. And, unfortunately, it certainly keeps me busy. But there are a lot of these examples, right? There are a lot of these kind of problems and blind spots. And I've found that Twitter, and especially with the screenshots, right, the things that you really can't run from, tends to be a good way to highlight that when the discrepancy is really considerable.
How often do you find that when you do one of your threads where you're sort of exposing, like in this case, it was a Washington Post headline that you were upset about. Mm-hmm. How often do you find that when you pick something out that's so egregious and you do a thread on it, the people that you're lampooning or the people you're exposing, do they ever contact you? Do they ever come back on you? How often do you find yourself either in a public or private spat with the people that you're fact checking?
It's rare. It has happened a few times. There's been a few times where I think I just missed the mark. And so I remember Ian Bremmer had called me out at one point because he was like, you kind of took this out of context. And you've got to have, and he's like, and I get what you're saying here. There are a lot of other really good examples. So I'm not really sure why you looped me in here. And so from time to time that happens. Once in a blue moon, I'll have someone who blocks me. There are a few people who haven't, and it continues to kind of surprise me. I'm sure they have me muted. But to be honest with you, it's very rare that anyone reaches out and contacts me back. I started trying to tag the individual reporters who byline these pieces, because usually what tends to happen is I spend my time focused on mistakes that most of the corporate press have made, as opposed to one specific outlet. And so what I've tried to do is go through and not just tag these outlets, but tag the reporters who bylined it. Because who knows, maybe I'm wrong, right? If they want to push back in good faith, in public, in private, what have you, and say, no, this isn't true, this isn't fair, I'm happy to have that conversation. It very rarely happens.
Do you sort of view yourself as something of an ombudsman for, sort of the Twitter journalism? I mean, there was a time when corporate media outlets, big newspapers would have somebody like that. There were more editors, there were more people who provided oversight. But I sort of look at your stuff and I think, this is sort of the new oversight, right? And it's you're not being paid to do it. You're just an interested party. You obviously are a conservative. But that doesn't really matter. I mean, what matters is, are people getting things right? And is that how you view your role? Do you think that that's the sort of the future of the way this is going to work? Media outlets don't employ people like you, so you have to just sort of show up and do it as a public service?
Yeah, I don't want to give myself too much credit in terms of an ombudsman. I'm saying it wrong. Ombudsman. And so I guess the short answer to your question is yes, I'm trying to provide that public service, right? I do earnestly believe that it needs to happen. I'm doing it as yeoman's work. I'm doing it in my spare time. And so I think it's an important public good. But ideally, I think what I'm hoping will happen over time is that if I spend enough time holding up a mirror, that enough people will be able to connect the dots. Because one of kind of my hypotheses about all of this is I think a lot of this stuff really is a blind spot. I think a lot of conservatives probably have a darker perspective in terms of why the media does what they do and what's driving that and what's motivating it. And I think for me, while there are certainly bad actors out there, I think what it really comes down to is no one's looking, no one's paying attention, or at least not enough people are. The news cycles move quickly, people move on to whatever the next latest and greatest thing is. And so what I'm trying to do is hold up that mirror as often as possible when these types of things happen. I won't pretend that I have a high degree of confidence that over time that will cause a New York Times or Washington Post to step back and say, oh, wow, we really got to start regulating this stuff ourselves. And so I do think that they'll probably just, over time end up with more people like me who are spending more time kind of fact checking these things, calling balls and strikes as well as we know how. And yeah, doing that, I think, again, at the risk of a little bit of self-flattery, trying to do that through the lens of public service, because at the end of the day, the trust in the media is bottoming out, right? It's hitting all-time lows left and right. And I think that needs to be fixed. And I'm trying to play a tiny, tiny role in helping that be fixed. And if it can't be fixed internally, then perhaps some external pressure can help move that along.
What I have detected in your stuff, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you view the media, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because I think you view the media generally the way I do, which is that a free and trusted press is vital to the functioning of American democracy. And I'm sure you're as chagrined as I am about the lack of trust in our media institutions. And one of the reasons I participate in it to the extent that I do is because I try everything I do, and I'm a conservative and I provide commentary, but I never go on TV thinking I'm going to make something up or I'm going to shade something or I'm going to omit something for the purpose of further driving my point. I want to make sure everything I say is true. I have a lot of, I take a lot of pride in, even if you don't like what I say, you'll never be able to say I was dishonest.
Right.
And I think I detect that you see it that way. Do you believe that your essential fact checking of these things is making a difference? Do you think that, can you tell ever that the people that you've fact checked or that you've threaded on, do you think it is impactful on the margins or more than that? Or do you think it's going to take a lot longer time to sort of get improvement out of the industry?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think maybe on the margins, right? And maybe with individual reporters on the margins. I think one of the things, if I'm looking at kind of data and metrics on these things, I do have more reporters reach out to me in private and say, oh man, this whole thing, right? When you have kind of these news cycles that implode pretty quickly, I think there has to be some measure of shame already that I'm trying to tap into. But I do think that this is a big shift. And in order to turn this thing, it's going to take a lot more time. It's going to take a lot more effort. It's going to take a lot more hands on the wheel, right, to be able to try and turn this thing. But I do think that particularly under a Democratic administration, we have seen the media at least sort of take on more of a watchdog role, particularly of late. And I think if you keep beating down on important talking points that are not just accurate, but are unassailable, that you can start to change this perception. I don't want to take credit for it, because I think what I end up doing in a lot of cases is I'm trying to speak to an audience that I think will be more receptive to me maybe than someone who's a little bit more of a fire breather on some of these issues. But I do think that pressure is starting to impact people. And I think some of it is because the American people aren't as easily fooled as I think some people and some politicians would like to pretend that they are. And so when you have people tuning out the media, when you have outlets and organizations who are seeing their readerships and their viewerships decline pretty precipitously, I think you have to start to assume, if you're willing to act in good faith, that some of this is driven by content that people simply don't trust anymore.
I guess one of the questions that media people have to ask themselves every day, and I think the business end of it is, how much are we doing here to try to please an audience, and how much are we doing here to deliver the truth? And I do think there are audience demands for narratives. There are narratives that people want to be true, and then they want things that happen in our world to fit neatly into those boxes. But the fact is, they rarely do. And one of the things you did recently that I thought was particularly impactful was going through the coverage of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. And you did some tweets on it. You also wrote a piece about it. And the headline of the piece was, "Everything the media told you about Kyle Rittenhouse was wrong." But it was wrong because they were trying to fit an event into a very neat box around the narrative that, there were essentially these white supremacist vigilantes roaming the countryside, when that turned out not to be the case at all. Maybe talk a little bit about the Rittenhouse case. I mean, if there is a textbook example of what you're trying to fix, it is this, right?
It is. And, I think there's a couple of, call it a hallmark of the sort of media moments that I think become the sorts of things where my ears kind of go up, and I'm waiting for a potential thread maybe to be the case. And so the Rittenhouse story from its start was one of those types, right? We've got a situation where we don't know a lot on the ground very quickly, but it is very, very quickly taken and jammed into those boxes that you talk about, right? What are the facts we know on the ground? There is a kid, 17 years old, happens to be white, has a gun, shots were fired, there are fatalities in the midst of a national reckoning over race. I think what happened was you saw a lot of people take those disparate data points while we were still waiting for a ton of information to come out. Forget even the trial. We're talking about police reports being made public, right? Very, very quickly, we saw a narrative kind of congeal around those limited data points that fit very neatly into, I think, kind of that media talk track, right? There had been a ton of coverage about the ways that white and Black people, particularly men, have disparate interactions with the police. And so there are all these kind of pinpricks of, well, imagine if you were Black. Well, why was he there in the first place? Well, why does anyone need a weapon of war in the first place? Forget it, in American city.
Right.
And so you start to see these details come out. And then I think what really got me, though, was very, very quickly, the language around him, both from your talking heads, your pundits, people weren't necessarily always acting in good faith, but even from media outlets, were definitive. There was a very strong viewpoint about what must have happened, what that must mean, what that must say about the United States, and what that must say about race in the United States. I mean, 48 hours after the shooting was announced, the New York Times already had a piece up, 32 paragraphs long, going through Rittenhouse's social media posts and talking about how he supported Blue Lives Matter. Right? It doesn't take a lot of forethinking to see what the reader is meant to pull out of this information. It's that something happened and this person is a certain way, and we can use our stereotypes, our perceptions about people, and we can sort out those messy details and facts and everything else that might underlie this case. And it turned out that was wrong. And I think we knew. I remember heading into the verdict of the trial, and I think it was mostly a foregone conclusion. You had coverage on places like MSNBC who were already talking about how awful it's going to be when this person walks. And I remember thinking to myself, as I'm kind of constructing this thread under the assumption that he probably will be found not guilty, at least on some of the charges, if not all of them. And I thought to myself, man, where was even this level of clear-eyedness? Where was that when all of this first started? Because we do see the media in a lot of other cases who are willing to suspend disbelief on cases, on facts when things happen, right? There was a Black motorist up in Waukesha who drove through a Christmas parade recently, right? There was a lot of assertions and allegations on the conservative side in this case that says, well, we have 6 white people who have died. We have a parade of predominantly white people killed by a Black man who had these posts on the social media that seemed at least racially motivated, if not outright racist, and certainly anti-Semitic. And so in that case, if you look at the media coverage, it is that there's nothing inferenced, right? There's no subtext. It is This thing happened. We're still waiting for.
Well, not only that, but in many cases, the tweets and the headlines were it made it seem like the car drove itself. SUV drives into crowd. Well, no, it didn't drive itself into the crowd.
Exactly.
And so there was an attempt to even extricate that there was a human being involved in this.
Right. And so when you compare and contrast those two things, you go from one case where you have this person who is certainly a white supremacist, at least, certainly an opponent of racial justice in this country. There's an AP fact check that pointed out that Rittenhouse supposedly was opposed to racial justice protesters. Right. There's no evidence at any point that that's actually the case, right? And so you have these things finding their way into fact checks, right? In one case. And then in this other case, we suspend our disbelief. And to be frank, I think it's really good when we suspend our disbelief, at least until we get the facts and the data to be able to come out and then draw some conclusions. But the rush to draw those conclusions when it's consistent with a narrative that, the 85% or so of people in the media who lean left are drawn to and find attractive, as do their viewers and their readers. When we rush to kind of smooth over all of those details, we lose a lot of the important aspects of reporting. And so that to me is a classic, what the Rittenhouse case really is a classic example of. And it was a rush to judgment in that front and ended up missing the mark on the meaningful facts involved.
Well, I mean, there's 2 reasons you would do this, right? Because you're trying to please an audience. who wants to believe things fit in these boxes, or you're trying to drive an outcome. I mean, if you look at the coverage of stories like this, if you look at the coverage of stories that have policy implications, there's a clear agenda usually behind the way things are covered, because you're trying to drive a policy outcome. And that none of that is journalism, by the way. It's advocacy, and there's a role for advocacy in this world. But when it masquerades as something else, I think it's damaging. You raised an issue that I think you should expound upon, because I think it's vital, and it's just this absolute lack of skepticism, whether it's in the Rittenhouse case or the Smollett case. All these cases where it was made immediately to fit so neatly. No one ever stops and says, well, wait a minute. Nothing is ever this clean. Nothing is ever this neat. Nothing ever fits into the pegs on this board as perfectly. Maybe we should ask a few more questions. And it makes the average person in flyover country or anywhere else wonder, well, is it a lack of skepticism, or is it intentional, or is it both? I mean, what's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm open that I'm maybe just a little bit wet behind the ears on this stuff, but I do think that by and large, it's an error rather than something that's a little bit more deliberately kind of malignant. So I think what it really comes down to is that you have within newsrooms, within the average newsroom, or within the average editorial team, there's kind of this monochromatic view of the world and how it operates. And so you've got a whole bunch of people who generally see the world somewhere between kind of 55% progressive, call it, and 75% progressive. They might quibble on the margins, but that for 70% of the average political disposition, you don't have a representation in the average newsroom. And if you do, it's a minority state, right? You look at an example like a Barry Weiss from the New York Times, who was, I don't know, probably the most conservative college student once upon a time in an Ivy League class, but certainly isn't what most conservatives would think of as kind of this rock-ribbed, or fire-breathing conservative. And so up until that viewpoint, you just don't have people representing it. I think because of that, there are certain blind spots. There are certain questions that you ask if you are having to meet someone in good faith where you don't share an identical view of the world. Sometimes that's something like, well, I don't know, maybe a 17-year-old with a gun might have a place when a city is burning down. Sometimes it's, you mentioned the Smollett case. I think that there's a desire also to be first. So I think it's two things. First, I think it's mostly errors made in good faith. It's a rush to be first as well. And so I think the rush to be first can force people to suspend maybe some of the questions that they should be asking in their mind. I mean, the Smollett case is a classic example of that. If someone had just stepped back and thought, wow, isn't it odd that on one of the coldest nights of the year in Chicago, the two most racist fans of Empire happen to be outside walking around at the exact same time as Jussie Smollett? If you just kind of ask those questions, rather than say, we have another case of race, we have this horrible violence, we have a terrible legacy in this country of racism and racist violence, and look, it's happened again. Rather than jump to that necessary conclusion every time these sorts of things happen, I think you would have a lot fewer of these misses, and they take off quickly. And that's another part of the problem with this race to be first.
I think the race to be first is corrosive. But I think what people know is that if you are the first one to take a circumstance or a story and fit it into one of these narrative boxes, these pre-approved narratives, the echo chamber for those narratives is so powerful. So if you fit the Smollett case, or you fit the Rittenhouse case, or you take whatever happens next week, 3 weeks from now, and you're the first one to kind of string it together, fit it in the box, there is a powerful echo chamber out there, online, in media, across Democratic politicians. Don't forget, one of the most powerful drivers of the Smollett narrative were all the people running for president of the United States, from Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, I think, was first. And so the knowledge of knowing that support system for your stuff, your content exists, I think, is often too powerful for people to resist. You're on the Flyover Country podcast. I'm Scott Jennings. Thank you for being with us today. Our guest is Drew Holden, who is a freelance writer and a prolific threader on Twitter. And you can find him on Twitter at Drew Holden 360. I follow him. I've followed him for a long time. And I think what he does on Twitter is fascinating, important. and brings a lot of a sanity to some of the stories and information you see out there, because often what we see is not true. And Drew shines a light on a lot of it. Drew, you fact check and do these threads on media outlets often. You also have shined some lights on the Biden White House recently. The White House sent out a list of accomplishments, a year-end list of accomplishments for themselves, and it went out to a select group of reporters. You then discovered this was happening and that media outlets were then issuing these things and tweeting them out word for word.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you might, it's one of your latest threads. If you go to @DrewHolden360, you can see it. Thought you might want to talk about that a little bit, because it's getting a lot of attention out there in the conservative news world right now.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so the Biden White House sends out, again, to a handful of friendly reporters. They say, hey, look, these are a list of accomplishments. This is what we were able to do in the past year. And it was ham-handed, I think, to put it mildly. They had a number of facts and stats where they're talking about things like vaccination rates over the last year and how much they've changed, without at any point kind of getting into the weeds and the details of, well, you know, a year and a week ago, the first vaccine went into somebody's arm. So of course, we're going to see a pretty considerable, regardless of any steps taken by the administration, obviously we're going to see it. But where I think it really kind of ran off the rails a little bit was that it also dealt with the issue of inflation, which of course the Biden administration is taking a lot of flack for. There's a recent poll, an ABC Ipsos poll actually, that came out that about 70% of Americans think that Biden's handling of inflation and prices is bad. And that includes a majority of Democrats. Yes. Who also agree that this is a problem. So Biden administration says that they've taken considerable action to address these things. They talked, one, about how they had released oil from the strategic oil reserves, which naturally wouldn't even be necessary if they hadn't done things like shut down pipelines across the country that are good for delivering oil. But I really think that the richest of all of them, and they held this up as a victory, right? An important data point that's a victory, was that gas prices had gone down almost 10 cents from their recent highs. Anyone, I think, who has driven past the pump at any point in the last few months has noticed that prices have spiked pretty considerably. The prices remain incredibly high. There's been a little bit of a dip down recently, and they've held that up as a data point, which, while not only intellectually disingenuous because it's obvious they're not really driving these prices down, it's also a little bit silly when this same administration had said, a couple of months prior, that they had no control over these things. It's external sources that are driving all this. It's not that at all. So I looked at it and I was like, you know what? Maybe people won't pick it up. It seems a little bit ridiculous. Every administration has to have some spin and some PR to kind of help themselves out. But then I noticed shortly after I posted the thread that Axios, an outlet that I like and trust and read pretty often, had put up a story that was essentially all of their talking points for the first 90% of this story, right? Axios, they do shorter stories. They had one sentence as kind of a caveat at the very end that pointed out that people and businesses were frustrated by inflation, and then closed with what the Biden administration was talking about. I remember I looked at it and I thought, I wish everyday Americans knew that this was how the sausage was made in so many of these cases, because it really is. There's no fact finding, there's no reporting, there's no real evidence gathering. It's, hey, here's what we think about ourselves. Cut, copy, paste, drop in, send out to readership with a tiny, tiny little caveat that obviously doesn't cover the vast majority of what was pretty facially ridiculous about the memo they had sent out in the first place.
Yeah, the what the Biden White House did, and then what some media outlets were willing to do for them, was really fascinating to me when you consider just how differently a reporter would have treated that from Trump or George W. Bush. And I think a lot of people are just asking, what is the role of the Washington press corps when a Democrat is president versus when a Republican is president? And my view is they should be skeptical and hard on all of them.
Right.
And I think that's what most Americans would expect. But the thing you expose tells us that maybe that's not the case. And when you consider, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, when you consider just how often the Biden White House has been willing to lie, shade the truth, spin things in a very, very dishonest way, They do it all the time. And I'm not here to say Donald Trump didn't, because obviously he said things all the time that were totally erroneous, made up out of thin air.
Yep.
And he got everything he deserved, for doing that.
Yeah.
But why doesn't Joe Biden deserve, and why doesn't his White House deserve the same kind of treatment when they're willing? Because to me, it's disrespectful of the press, right? If they tell you something, that's not true, they're almost disrespecting you, saying, we know you won't do anything about it, or we know you're not smart enough to figure it out, or we know you're a lapdog. And I don't know. I just find it to be amazing that reporters aren't harder on them. I mean, first of all, are you surprised the level of which the Biden White House is dishonest? I mean, the entire campaign he ran against Trump was, this guy's a liar and I'm not. I mean, that was essentially the underpinning of everything. Yet here we are.
Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised. I think that I kind of expected after Biden had won the election that he would kind of come back a little bit more to the fold and be a little bit more moderate in a lot of things, right? From policy to disposition to certainly the way that his administration has dealt with the press. And I think, you've seen a few different examples, particularly I think with Jen Psaki up there in the briefing room, when she's talking to reporters, that she says things that are just nonsensical, right? And she'll get pushed from time to time. But I think it's what it's really emblematic of is the Democratic Party, particularly over the last 4 years of Donald Trump, has gotten enormously comfortable with the idea that part of the role of the press is to attack the bad guys, being Republicans, and go a little bit easier on the Democrats because they are the adults in the room, right? And that I think for a period of time, there is this sentiment within the media that, well, sure, maybe this statement from Joe Biden shaded the truth a little bit, but look at what Trump was saying.
Yeah, it's not anywhere near as bad. Exactly.
Yeah. It's completely out of hand. And so I think the Democrats in a lot of ways were kind of lulled into this sense of, well, these guys got our back, right? Like if their job is to call balls and strikes and we're playing baseball against Donald Trump, then the balls and strikes are going to go our way, even if they're not perfect, right? Even if they're not necessarily advocating for us that these things are going to shake out. And I think they're now realizing that once they get into power, that's a lot harder. While it is harder, while there is more pushback, I think that the way that the press, generally speaking, reacted to the withdrawal from Afghanistan really caught the Biden administration by surprise, because they assumed that these folks were going to work hand in glove with them on the details, and it's so hard, and we promised we'd do this thing, that when they did come at them in a more dogged way, it was incredibly surprising. But it seems like after that, they've kind of gone back to this assumption that as long as they're willing to be nicer to the press than Donald Trump, that the press will do a pretty good job of carrying their talking points.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I have to give most media outlets credit. Around the Afghanistan debacle, just about everybody correctly was hard on the Biden administration, Biden himself, and, on him personally, on the administration's execution, on the, from top to bottom. That was a thorough job that was done to expose the incompetence and the real, the draining of American prestige. But I think what happened was, I think everybody came to realize that moment is where Biden really sort of fell off the table in terms of his own job approval. It sucked a lot of his oxygen out of the room. It reduced his effectiveness overall, I think, to manage public affairs in Washington. And now I think there's a scramble to try to put him back up on a pedestal, but it's not working. And because ever since Afghanistan, there's just been a persistent anvil, basically on Biden's head. Let me ask you a question, simple question. And I don't know if you've thought about it much, but do you consider yourself to be a journalist? Because I was thinking about this interview, and we're talking about journalism, and we're talking about what you do around journalism. And I thought, well, what do I depend on journalists for? To give me true factual information about things I care about that impact my world. Well, that's what you do. And so do you consider, you work in public affairs, same as me. We're both in the same sort of space. But I actually think of you, when I open up my Twitter feed and I see your name, I think, well, here comes Drew with the journalism. Do you consider yourself to be one?
Well, first, thank you. I've always been a little bit hesitant to apply the label journalist to myself. I think it's probably for two reasons. One, I work in public affairs. I moonlight and I do this thing and I do the threads. But what's running through it for me always is commentary. I have my own views of the world and how it works and how it operates. And I don't think I'm particularly impartial. I try to be impartial, and I think I probably take more pains to be impartial than lots and lots of people who, like myself, talk too much on Twitter. But I'm not in any meaningful sense, I think, I'm not unbiased in the way that I approach these issues. So I'm hesitant to apply the label journalist. But then when I really step back and think about it, again, at the risk of some self-flattery, I think that's the goal, right? That's what I'm trying to do, is that I'm trying to be informative. And at the end of the day, I'm certainly not trying to be the sort of resource that only a Republican is interested in, right? Like, I want to be able to help journalists. I want to be able to help media outlets who tend to lean left, and people on the other side of the aisle, including Democrats, to be better, to be more honest. And so while I think I struggle a little bit with the label journalist, I'm coming around to the idea that maybe the sort of thing that I do and the variety of commentary that I do might be closer to journalism than to anything else.
Well, if you look at a lot of media outlets today, they employ people who I think they characterize as journalists whose job is media watchdog. CNN
Right.
has one, Fox has. I mean, most of the outlets have somebody who's sort of on the media beat. And candidly, I don't know what the difference is between what you do and what they do. And I think you do it very well. And I think what you said about your point of view, though, is interesting, because even in that, you're honest about who you are. And I think and I think the average journalist they want everyone to believe they're impartial, that they don't have a point of view, but it's perfectly natural to have a point of view. And I actually think being honest about who you are enhances your own credibility, because you're willing to say it up front. I was looking at some tweets yesterday after Joe Manchin dropped the bomb on BBB. And of course, the most egregious one, maybe you disagree, but I thought the most egregious one was Sam Stein of Politico, who said, objectively speaking, this is devastating for the planet. Right. And I mean, it's just sort of it's a reminder that at the end of the day, everybody has a point of view, and that's fine. But to me, the most credible people are the ones who are willing to tell you, well, here is my point of view, and I'm not going to lie to you.
Yeah. And I think part of that too, Scott, is that it matters in the micro for the person, but I think it also really matters in the more macro in the newsroom, right? Because one of the things that I keep coming back to is this idea that it's fine if the Sam Steins of the world have political beliefs. Everyone has political beliefs, right? It's fine if in their heart of hearts, there are candidates they like more than others. But I think where it really becomes a problem is when 80% or so, and I keep using that 80% figure. There was a study out of the University of Indiana, I think back in 2014, that found that only about 16% of journalists and newsrooms across the country, that includes local outlets and other places, are Republicans, that the overwhelming majority of them are independents, but independents who align with Democrats. And then there's also a lot more independents, or a lot more Democrats than Republicans, about 5-1. So when you work out all the numbers, it's at about 84% of journalists, give or take. And this was a different era, right? When there were probably more conservative journalists aren't conservative. And so for me, I think one of the reasons I want to be upfront about it is that people understand what I'm saying and where I'm coming from. Part of it too is I want to be open and honest about my blind spots. I think one of the big problems, if you look at, say, the New York Times' coverage of the Russian collusion narrative, is that what it's missing, and what probably could have helped it, is if there were people who were sitting in that room when they're writing these Pulitzer Prize winning pieces who supported President Trump, or who at least understood President Trump, or why someone would vote for someone like President Trump. And so you've got these blind spots that end up bubbling up, where when the numbers are skewed so overwhelmingly towards people with a certain view of the world, that they've all kind of got these same blind spots. And so what I'm trying to do, and I'm sure there are other, there are media reporters, as you mentioned, at Fox and other places who are trying to do that, who's just trying to kind of hold up that sign and say, look, this is what you're missing, right? You're taking a turn, you can't see it on your right, and you're crashing into the car on the right of you because it was in your blind spot. That's what I'm trying to be able to reveal, I think, to these folks. And that's why I think that having someone who is, call me a media reporter for a second, like having someone who writes about the media is important, because that lens through which people view these issues, all issues really, is incredibly important.
You're listening to Drew Holden here on the Flyover Country podcast. That's our guest this week. I'm Scott Jennings. Thanks for being with us, Drew. I want to ask you one more thing before we get to the famous lightning round. And it has to do with conservative engagement on social media. Your big medium is Twitter. You have 145,000 Twitter followers. It feels like an arena, though, in which conservatives I think sometimes have issues with consistently being able to reach audiences.
Mhm.
You've obviously built up a pretty large following. If you had advice for conservatives, what is it in terms of building audience and then achieving some level of consistency? And then do you ever feel like you are experiencing any sort of interruption in information delivery? I will just say, I've talked to a lot of conservatives over the last few weeks, and there seems to be something going on out there about, occasionally I tweet and it goes huge, and occasionally I tweet and nothing happens, and there seems to be no rhyme or reason to it. Was curious about these issues and your experience with it over the last couple of years.
Yeah, happy to. So I think in terms of advice, I kind of have two things that I try and treat as something close to a North Star. The first thing I know we've talked about a little bit is be clear about your own biases, and then make a deliberate effort to try to see them or try and recognize how they bleed into your view of the world and your view on particular facts, stories you're writing about, things like that. So I think that's probably the first one. And the second one, which is advice I think I've heard from a handful of reporters and other people with more experience in this universe than I do, that I think is important, is be earnest. I think that there's I hope it's a fad, but I don't know if it's quite that passing, but a lot of younger reporters and younger people on Twitter and who want to kind of make a name for themselves in the media or wherever it is, it can be easy to be flip and sarcastic and try and make witty jokes all the time. And I'm not saying be a bore, right, and be lame, but I think it's really worth being earnest on these things. And if you want people to take you seriously, it's not that you can't post dog pictures from time to time, but that you should really try and be earnest and objective as often as you can, and it's worth doing that. And particularly for young writers who I talk to, that's one of the big points I want them to take away is treat yourself seriously. Because if you can't get far enough to treat yourself seriously, I guarantee you the rest of the world is going to have a very, very hard time taking you seriously at all. So that's
Drew Holden,
in terms of it.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, in terms of advice, that's where I tend to net out, at least from my experience on the platform.
Do you ever feel like you put stuff out that is? I mean, the term is shadow banning, but I don't know exactly what that means, except to say that it does seem like sometimes certain content doesn't reach the same audience levels that it might seem like it should. Do you ever feel like that happens to your stuff?
Yeah, it's interesting. I really haven't. I have felt it happen to me as a consumer, as a receiver of other people's tweets, where I'll sit back and think, man, I haven't seen a tweet from Dana Loesch, who I've interacted with a ton of times. I haven't seen her tweet anything in, it seems like, weeks. And I'll go to her profile and she'll have all of these tweets. I think, like, why aren't these finding their way into my feed? I haven't really felt it though. And it might be because it's happening to me. It's not quite as egregious. It might be that I'm just missing it. But no, I don't think I've ever sent something out and then thought, where on earth did that go?
Interesting. Drew Holden, you've been a great guest. And now we're going to play the lightning round game. At the end of each Flyover Country podcast, every guest gets to have a lightning round, a short answer or one answer questions, and answer them however you wish. But it is lightning, and the name lightning is for a reason. Number one, where does Drew get his news every day?
Mostly the New York Times.
New York Times, number one. All right. Number two, who is your best non-political follow on Twitter?
Great question. I feel the lightning ticking down. There are a number of athletes who I think are great. Inez Cantor is one who has recently gotten political. So if he counts as non-political,
sure,
he's my lightning.
And who's your worst follow on Twitter? The one you're most embarrassed about?
Jen Rubin. Jen Rubin, Washington Post, and I follow her religiously.
Yeah, she's something else. Do you think Donald Trump should be allowed back on Twitter?
Yes, I think he should.
Do you have a favorite tweet of all time that you have written that you consider to be the Drew Holden gold standard tweet?
Yeah, I've got it pinned. It's that I think a lot of people one day are going to have egg on their face when they when we learn more about the origins of coronavirus, and they wrote off the idea that maybe, just maybe, it could have come from a level 4 bio facility that happened to be right down the street from where we first started seeing cases.
Do you have any New Year's resolutions?
Spend less time on Twitter. I'm not confident I'll do it, but I think I'm going to try and pull myself off of the platform and news in general. A little bit more, not a lot, but a little bit.
What is your boldest political prediction for 2022?
So I think there'll be a red wave, and I think it will make 2010 look mundane. I think it will be substantially dramatic.
All right. Since you think there's going to be a red wave, do you believe Kevin McCarthy will be the next Speaker of the House?
Yeah, given a lack of other options, I think he will be.
Any predictions on which politician will be involved in the next biggest political scandal?
Ooh, it's got to be Ron DeSantis because he's ascendant, and I'm sure that there are a lot of people investing an enormous amount of time, and they'll come up with something even if it's not very good.
Do you believe that your own Twitter account will be suspended at any point in 2022?
No, I don't think it will be.
All right, Drew Holden. At Drew Holden 360 is where we find you on Twitter, and you do write articles from time to time. You've written for the New York Times, Fox News, the Washington Post, National Review Online. Anywhere else folks can find you if they want to see your stuff, or is that the main stuff?
That's the main stuff. I've written a little bit recently for the Washington Free Beacon, so you'll see me there lately as well.
All right, Drew, you've been a great guest. Thanks for joining us on Flyover Country.
Scott, pleasure's mine. Really appreciate you having me.
Thanks. Flyover Country with Scott Jennings is a production of Bluegrass Media Lab, coming to you from the heart of Middle America, Louisville, Kentucky. If you like what you heard, subscribe to Flyover Country on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcast. 5-star reviews will help us keep making the content that you love. To find my latest television hits, columns, and other commentary, go to scottjenningsky.com. And you can also find me at scottjenningsky on Twitter and Facebook. Thanks for listening, and talk to you soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, make sure your seat backs and folding trays are in their full upright position. Cabin crew, please take your seats for landing, and thank you for choosing Flyover Country with Scott Jennings.